I returned from a business trip to find my $3 million mountain home had been erased. The HOA I never joined had reduced it to smoldering rubble. They thought they were flexing power on some nobody who ignored their fake fines. But they made one catastrophic mistake. They didn't just destroy my house. They desecrated the fireplace holding my late wife's ashes. And they had no idea who they had just declared war on. All for failing to pay HOA fines on a property that wasn't even under their jurisdiction. When I pulled up, there was nothing but scorched earth where my home once stood. They hadn't just bulldozed a structure. They had obliterated the place where I buried my late wife's ashes, the fireplace that was our spiritual center. The HOA president thought she was flexing her power on some random guy who ignored her fake notices. But what she didn't know was exactly who she had just declared war on. How far would you go to make them pay for destroying everything you hold dear? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, because this story of justice is absolutely epic. The drive up the mountain was always my favorite part of coming home. After 2 weeks in Norway, dealing with ministers and trade agreements under a different name, all I wanted was the quiet of my own land. The air coming through the open window of my truck smelled like pine and cold rock. It was a crisp, clear Colorado morning in early October, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only person on Earth. I passed my gate, a simple but solid steel barrier, and noted the green light on the solar-powered keypad was steady. Everything was in order. The long gravel driveway curved up through a stand of aspens, their leaves a brilliant shimmering gold. I built this road myself 12 years ago, making sure the grade was just right. I designed the drainage, calculated the load capacity, and graded it with a rented bobcat until it was perfect. Every inch of this land was familiar to me. I knew which trees the hawks preferred and where the deer bedded down at night. It wasn't just property. It was my sanctuary, a place of peace I'd built with my wife Sarah before she passed. I rounded the final bend, the one where the trees always split just enough to reveal the house. In my mind, I was already picturing it. The solid Douglas fir logs, the dark gray river stone chimney, the wide deck overlooking the valley. I could almost taste the coffee I was about to make. But there was nothing there. I stopped the truck, the engine idling in the unnerving silence. My brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. Where my home should have been, there was just a raw brown scar on the landscape. A wasteland of splintered wood, shattered stone, and twisted metal, all pushed into messy piles. A curl of smoke drifted up from what was left of the main support beam. It wasn't gone. It was annihilated. My heart didn't pound. It went cold and heavy like a block of ice in my chest. This wasn't a fire. A fire leaves a skeleton, a blackened shell. This was a demolition, a deliberate, methodical razing. I put the truck in park and got out, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air smelled of soot, diesel, and freshly turned earth. Underneath, though, my memory betrayed me with scents that shouldn't still exist. A faint hint of cedar from the beams and the vanilla candle Sarah always loved. Now it was all just ash. Deep, muddy tracks from a large excavator tore through my lawn, leading from the disaster site back down my driveway. I followed them with my eyes and saw it parked just off the road behind a cluster of pines, as if someone tried to hide it. A rented flatbed truck with a small professionally printed magnetic sign on the door. It showed a cheesy logo of a house inside a circle with the words, Aspen Creek HOA Community Compliance. I felt a surge of something hot and sharp in my gut, but I pushed it down. Anger is useless without data. I'm an engineer, a governor. I solve problems with facts, not feelings. I pulled out my phone, my hands steady. The property was covered by a closed-circuit security system I had designed myself. 6 high-definition cameras, solar-powered, with their own dedicated cellular link. They uploaded all motion-triggered recordings to a private encrypted server. I didn't need a Wi-Fi connection or even power from the house. They were built to be independent. I opened my email and searched for alerts from the system. They were all there. A neat chronological list. Motion detected. Driveway cam. Motion detected. Front porch. The first one was dated 3 days ago. I tapped on it. The email opened to show a video thumbnail. A white work truck, not the HOA one, was parked at my gate. A man in a fluorescent vest got out and taped a piece of paper to my gate post. I zoomed in on the paper. It was bright orange, an official-looking notice. The next alert, from an hour later, showed a lowboy trailer carrying a Komatsu excavator grinding its way up my driveway. My driveway, which was clearly marked with a private property, no trespassing sign. I scrolled to the next day's alerts. At 8 a.m., a demolition crew, 5 men in hard hats, laughing and drinking coffee, stood by their equipment. They looked at my home like it was just another job. The lead camera, the one aimed at the front door, picked up their conversation. The audio was clear. One of them pointed a thumb at the house. "You sure about this, boss?" "Thing's a fortress." A gruff voice answered, "Got the papers right here. Emergency compliance order. Signed by the county." He waved a clipboard. A total lie. My house was built to withstand anything the Rockies could throw at it. I'd overseen every beam, every joint, every single stone laid for the foundation. It was more solid than the mountain it was built on. I watched in cold, silent fury as the footage played out. The excavator's claws smashed through the beautiful bay window in the living room, the one where Sarah used to sit and read. The crash of the roof coming down. The way they bulldozed the great stone fireplace, the heart of our home, into a pile of rubble. It was under that hearthstone I had buried Sarah's ashes. And now they were gone, scattered in the dirt and debris. The demolition crew was just following orders. They were tools. The real problem was the person who gave the order. The one who held the clipboard and waved those forged papers. Aspen Creek HOA. I knew who they were. A little kingdom of petty tyrants run by a woman named Brenda Winters. She'd sent me letters before, stuffed into my mailbox down at the end of the county road. Fussy, passive-aggressive notes about things like my unapproved flagpole or the non-compliant color of my metal roof. Even though you couldn't even see my house from their subdivision. I'd ignored them, of course, because the real kicker, the one simple fact that made this whole thing not just a tragedy, but a full-blown crime, was sitting in a safe deposit box downtown, the original deed, the plat maps, the legal documents that proved without a shadow of a doubt that my property was never part of their HOA. I never signed their bylaws. I never agreed to their rules. I never paid their ridiculous fines, and legally I didn't have to. They had no authority here, no jurisdiction. They were strangers who had trespassed on my land and destroyed my life, all for the feeling of a little bit of power. I stood there looking at the ruin of my home under the clear blue sky, and I made a quiet promise to the memory of my wife. I don't make threats. I build cases. And I was about to build a case so solid, so undeniable, that it would tear their little kingdom down to the foundation. I didn't call the police. I didn't call a lawyer. The first calls you make in a crisis are often the wrong ones, driven by shock and emotion. My training, both in the military and in engineering, taught me to work the problem. Start with what you know and build from there. The problem here wasn't just a pile of rubble. It was a chain of false authority. And to break a chain, you have to find the weakest link. The weakest link is always the lie. I got back in my truck, turned around, and drove down the mountain, leaving the wreckage behind me for now. My destination was the Jefferson County Recorder of Deeds office, a boring beige building downtown that holds more power than most people realize. It's where ownership becomes fact. I walked in, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dusty binders. A clerk, a pleasant woman named Judy, whom I knew from my county commissioner days, looked up from her computer. I didn't use my title. I was just a citizen. "Judy, I need to pull the plat maps for the Aspen Creek subdivision, Section 3, and the original incorporation documents for the Aspen Creek Homeowners Association." She nodded, tapped a few keys, and a few minutes later handed me a set of large, crisp printouts. I spread the maps across an empty table. I found my parcel number, 45B. It was a clean 20-acre rectangle on the edge of the survey. The key was in the fine print at the bottom of the page. Plat recorded and approved. Jefferson County Planning Commission, June 4th, 2010. My lot was officially and legally subdivided on that date. Next, I opened the file with the HA's Articles of Incorporation. I scanned down to the filing date. Date of incorporation, December 18th, 2011. It was right there in black and white. My property had existed as a separate legal entity for a year and a half before the HOA was even created. They couldn't retroactively force me into their association. I was excluded by law, by date, and by common sense. I took photos of the documents with my phone, clear shots of the parcel number, and the filing dates. This was my foundation, the first solid piece of evidence. The lie was that they had any power over me at all. On my way back, I stopped at the cluster of community mailboxes at the base of the county road. I hadn't checked mine in over 2 weeks. Inside, buried under a pile of junk mail, was a thick, formal-looking envelope. The return address was just Aspen Creek HOA Compliance Department. Inside was a multi-page document printed on heavy paper designed to look as intimidating as possible. At the top, in big red letters, it said, "Final Notice of Intent to Enforce Compliance." I scanned the list of violations. Fine 1, $2,500 for a non-permitted flagpole, a flagpole I got a county permit for and installed 10 years ago. Fine 2, $5,000 for unauthorized roofing material, a standing seam metal roof specifically chosen for fire resistance and approved by the county fire marshal. Fine 3, $4,320 for accumulated fees due to failure to respond to inspection requests. In total, they claimed I owed them $11,820. They had manufactured a debt out of thin air using their own fake rules as justification. This notice was their paper shield, the document they would wave to pretend their actions were legal. They needed a reason, and they had built one on a foundation of lies. That evening, I drove to my secure storage unit in town. Inside, under a locked file cabinet, were all my important papers. I pulled the original land deed for the mountain property. It was signed and dated 12 years ago. A simple, powerful document. I laid it on the cool concrete floor. Next to it, I placed the building permit for the house itself. Then the electrical inspection certificates, the septic system approval, and finally the 2 documents that directly refuted their fines, the stamped and sealed permit for the flagpole, and the fire marshal's final sign-off on the roofing materials. Each one was a receipt. Each one was a fact. Each one was a nail in the coffin I was building for Brenda Winters and her HOA. I could see exactly what she had done. Sometime after getting her little HOA off the ground, she must have seen my property sitting just outside her boundary, an independent home bigger than any in her subdivision, refusing to bend to her will, so she had simply decided to absorb it. She likely filed an annexation document with the HA's private records, a meaningless piece of paper she never filed with the county, and started treating my land as her own. She added my parcel to her own little map and started sending notices, assuming I'd either be intimidated into paying or would simply ignore her, which I did. She counted on me not knowing my rights or not caring enough to fight. It was no longer just about the house. It wasn't about the money. Standing there in the quiet, sterile light of the storage unit, I looked at the deed Sarah and I had signed together. I remembered her excitement, the way she had drawn the floor plans herself on graph paper at our old kitchen table. She'd spent a year researching the perfect river stones for the fireplace. It had to be big enough to warm the whole great room, a place where our future grandkids would hang their stockings. After she was gone, building that house was the only thing that kept me moving forward. Fulfilling that dream was my final promise to her. And the fireplace was more than stone and mortar. It was her memorial, her final resting place. Brenda Winters hadn't just demolished a building. She had reached into my past and desecrated a memory. She had violated the one place on earth that was sacred to me and my family. The anger I felt was cold now and sharp as broken glass. It was the anger of a man who has nothing left to lose and all the receipts he needs to prove it. That fireplace was gone and someone was going to answer for it. The Aspen Creek HOA monthly meeting was held in the subdivision's community clubhouse, a building with all the charm of a doctor's waiting room. Flimsy folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a long table where the board sat. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade air freshener. It was a sterile environment for the exercise of petty power. I arrived 5 minutes early wearing jeans, a flannel shirt, and a simple work jacket. I didn't want to be the governor. I didn't want to be a decorated veteran or a licensed engineer. I wanted to be the man whose house they had just illegally demolished. I found an empty chair in the back corner near the door. My presence went unnoticed. I was just another face in a small crowd of about 15 residents, most of them retirees who looked bored and vaguely resentful to be there. At the head table sat Brenda Winters. She was exactly as I pictured, perfectly coiffed gray hair, a crisp blazer, and a clipboard that she treated like a scepter of office. She called the meeting to order with a sharp tap of her pen. For 20 minutes, I listened to them discuss the mundane tyranny of suburban life, a heated debate about the approved shade of beige for mailbox posts, a stern warning about leaving trash cans visible from the street for more than 6 hours on collection day. Brenda presided over it all with an air of grave importance, as if she were deciding matters of state. She corrected people's grammar. She cut speakers off when their allotted 2 minutes were up. She was the queen of her tiny beige kingdom. Then she moved on to new business. A thin, triumphant smile touched her lips. She scanned the room, making eye contact with her followers. On a very positive note, she began, her voice ringing with false modesty. I'm pleased to announce the successful resolution of a long-standing compliance issue. We finally cleared that eyesore up the hill. A few people nodded knowingly. The owner had been derelict for years, ignored his dues, violated multiple covenants, and refused all attempts at communication. She paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of her fake verdict settle on the room. Under the emergency provisions of our bylaws, the board voted unanimously to declare the property abandoned and a structural hazard. The demolition was completed 2 days ago, improving community safety and property values for everyone. A smattering of polite applause broke out from the front rows. Brenda beamed, basking in it. This was my cue. I didn't get up quickly. I rose slowly, deliberately, the legs of my chair scraping softly against the linoleum. Every head turned towards the back of the room. The quiet confidence of a man who knows he's right has a gravity all its own. The room fell silent. Brenda's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance at being interrupted. Do you have a question? She asked, her tone sharp. I walked forward, stopping about 10 feet from her table. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke in a calm, measured tone, the way you'd state a simple, undeniable fact. My name is Redmond Kane. I own, or rather owned, the house you're referring to. A collective gasp went through the room. Brenda's face went rigid. She gripped her clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. And I have just one statement to make. I continued, letting my eyes drift over to the other board members who now looked like deer caught in headlights. I never signed your bylaws. I never agreed to be part of your association. And you demolished a home you had no jurisdiction over. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. You could have heard a pin drop. One board member, a young woman who looked barely 30, went pale. Another, a heavy-set man in a golf shirt, started sweating. Brenda recovered first. Her instinct was to attack, to re-establish dominance. That's preposterous, she snapped, finding her voice. Your property was annexed years ago. You received dozens of notices. We acted on an emergency enforcement order signed by the county. She was good. She used words like annexed and enforcement order to create a smokescreen of legitimacy. But I wasn't a confused homeowner she could bully. I was the man who signs actual state enforcement orders into law. While she spoke, my eyes scanned the room and landed on a cork bulletin board behind her. Under a sign that read Community Updates, tacked to the board were several documents. One was the orange notice I'd seen on my gate in the security footage. Another was a photocopy of a letter printed on what was supposed to be Jefferson County letterhead. I recognized the county seal, but it was wrong. The font was off and the watermark was missing. It was a forgery, a clumsy one, but good enough to fool a demolition contractor who just wanted to get paid. I ignored Brenda's tirade and walked calmly over to the bulletin board. This is a public meeting, correct? I asked the room at large. No one answered. I pulled out my phone, and these are public notices. I held up the phone and took a clear, high-resolution photograph of the forged county letter. Then another of the list of fines. What are you doing? Brenda demanded, her voice rising in panic. That is private HOA property. I turned back to face her. My phone was still in my hand, and I subtly pressed the record button. The small red light blinked on. "I'm just documenting the paperwork you used to justify destroying my home," I said evenly. "For the record, could you please restate your name and your official position on this board?" She stared at me, her mind racing, finally realizing she was no longer in control of the situation. She had built her entire world on a foundation of fake rules and forged documents, and it was beginning to crumble right in front of her. She didn't know who I was. Not really. She just saw a man who wasn't scared of her, and that was enough to terrify her. But I wasn't there to fight with her in a clubhouse. Confrontation is for amateurs. I don't make threats. I build cases. And I had just collected my first 2 receipts. I just needed 2 more. I left the clubhouse without another word. The seeds of chaos I had just planted would need time to sprout. Now it was time to build the rest of my case brick by brick, receipt by receipt. Brenda's entire claim rested on 3 pillars: that she had authority over my land, that she had followed a legal process, and that the demolition was necessary. I was going to dismantle all 3 pillars so completely that nothing would be left but dust. My approach was simple: prove everything with 3 easy steps. The next morning, I met with an old friend, a retired county planner named George, at a small diner downtown. Over coffee, I laid out the plat maps and the HOA incorporation documents on the table. George, a man who had spent 40 years looking at maps like these, put on his reading glasses and traced the boundary lines with his finger. "Well, Red," he said after a few minutes, "it's as plain as the nose on your face. Your parcel, 45B, was subdivided and recorded a full 18 months before this HOA even existed. They can't annex you without your express written and notarized consent, which would then have to be filed and recorded with my old office." He tapped the map. "They have 0 legal authority over you. None." That was step 1, confirm the chain of authority. I had George sign a sworn affidavit to that effect. It was another receipt for my collection, the official word of a respected expert. Step 2 was proving the fraud behind their legal process. Brenda had claimed they sent official notices and acted on a county order. The cornerstone of her defense was that forged letter I'd photographed on the bulletin board. Proving it was a fake was critical. That afternoon, I was in a different office. This one belonged to a friend of a friend who specialized in digital forensics. He was a young guy with glasses and a quiet intensity, the kind of person who sees the world in code. I showed him the high-resolution photo of the letter. "Can you tell me where this came from?" I asked. He nodded, loaded the image into his system, and started working. An hour later, he called me over. "The document properties are interesting," he said, pointing at his screen. The letterhead template was created in Microsoft Word. Standard stuff, but the metadata tells the real story. He showed me a string of code. Embedded within the file was a unique identifier linked to the specific copy of the software that created it. And that software was registered to a personal laptop. The registered owner, Brenda Winters, he read off the screen. And it was created last Tuesday at 11:14 p.m. on her personal home network, not a government server. There it was, digital proof. She hadn't just downloaded a fake template. She'd created the entire fraudulent document herself on her own computer. She had impersonated a county official to get what she wanted. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was a felony. That was the second receipt, the email trace that led directly back to her. For step 3, I needed to show that her claim of unpaid fines was a complete fabrication. If I owed the HOA over $11,000, they would have placed a lien on my property. A lien is a legal claim against an asset, and it has to be publicly recorded to be valid. The next morning, I called my title insurance company. They are meticulous record keepers as their entire business depends on knowing the precise legal status of a property. I asked for a full title history and any records of liens or encumbrances filed against my parcel. The agent called me back within the hour. "Mr. Kane," she said, "your title is completely clear. Has been since the day you bought the land. There has never been a lien, a notice of default, or any other encumbrance filed by the Aspen Creek HOA or any other entity. The fines had never been legally recorded because Brenda knew they were baseless. They only existed on her intimidating letters designed to scare people into paying. They were ghost deaths. I had the title company send me a certified report, another official document for my growing file. No legal notice, no binding authority, no demolition permit, no excuse. With the legal and procedural case locked down, I needed to address the final pillar of her lie, that the demolition was a matter of community safety. I called my friend Milo Chen. Milo is a structural engineer, one of the best in the state. He's calm, meticulous, and brilliant. We'd worked together in the military, rebuilding infrastructure in places where things had been blown up for real. I met him up at my property. The demolition crew had left the scene a mess. Milo walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning the steep grade of the mountainside. He used a laser measure, took soil samples, and flew a small drone to get aerial shots. After 2 hours, we sat on the tailgate of my truck, and he laid it out for me in his quiet, precise way. Red, this wasn't just a demolition. This was reckless endangerment. He pointed to a deep fissure in the earth that hadn't been there before. They destabilized the entire slope. Your foundation, the retaining walls you built, they were holding back tons of earth. When they ripped all that out without a geological survey or a proper excavation plan, they weakened the whole hillside. He showed me the drone footage. The houses downslope, the ones in the HOA, are now in a potential landslide zone. A heavy rain or a quick spring thaw and this whole section could give way. Brenda, in her arrogant rush to remove what she called an eyesore, had put her own community in real physical danger. Milo agreed to write up a full engineering report complete with geological data and risk assessments. His expert testimony would be the final crushing blow. Standing there looking at the damage, a cold realization settled over me. Brenda had set a fire she couldn't control, and the mountain wasn't the only thing about to collapse. Word of my confrontation at the last meeting had spread through the subdivision like wildfire. Brenda, trying to control the narrative, called an emergency HOA meeting to address the baseless claims made by a disgruntled non-resident. She scheduled it for a Saturday morning, hoping a weekend crowd would bolster her support. It was a tactical error. She underestimated the power of a single well-placed piece of information. The night before the meeting, I sent a single anonymous email. The recipients were the top reporters at 3 local news stations and the editor of the Jefferson County newspaper. The subject line was simple: HOA illegally demolishes private residence, forges county documents. Attached was a link to a password-protected webpage. On that page, I had uploaded one piece of evidence: the high-definition drone footage Milo had taken of the demolition site. It was edited cleanly with no commentary. It just showed the raw, ugly truth of the destruction and, more importantly, the alarming land erosion and slope instability Milo had identified. The final shot was a slow zoom out showing the damaged hillside looming directly above the neat little houses of the Aspen Creek subdivision. By morning, 2 local news vans were parked on the public road outside the clubhouse. Brenda's attempt to control the story had just blown up in her face. I walked into the meeting room a few minutes after it started. This time, the room was packed. The presence of news cameras outside had drawn a crowd. The atmosphere was tense, nervous. Brenda was at the podium trying to regain control. She was in the middle of a speech about protecting community standards when I entered. She faltered for a second, then doubled down. As I was saying, she pressed on, voice strained. We must stand firm against those who believe they're above the rules that the rest of us agree to live by. I didn't go to the back this time. I walked straight to the front of the room and stood beside the podium, holding a thin manila folder. The room fell into a dead, expectant silence. "This is a private meeting," she hissed. "You have no right to be here." I turned to the residents. "My name is Redmond Kane," I said again, my voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "I'm the man whose home your HOA president illegally destroyed." I opened the folder. "Mrs. Winters has told you a story about unpaid dues and safety hazards. I'm here to show you the receipts." I began by projecting the first document onto the large screen behind the board table using a small portable projector I brought with me. It was the county plat map with my property and the HOA boundary clearly marked. This is the official county map. As you can see, my land was never part of your HOA. Next, I showed them the certified title report. This is from my title company. It confirms no lien was ever placed on my property. The $11,820 in fines Mrs. Winters claimed I owed, they never legally existed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I clicked to the next slide. It was a side-by-side comparison, the forged county letter from their bulletin board next to a real one from the county archives. I pointed out the incorrect seal, the different font, the missing watermark. This document, which was used to authorize the demolition, is a forgery. The murmurs grew louder, more anxious. I then showed them the metadata trace with Brenda's name clearly listed as the creator. Someone in the crowd gasped. The junior board member, Dana Morales, stared at the screen, her face ashen. She knew. She had suspected it all along, and now the proof was undeniable, right in front of her. Then I played the video from my security cameras. The residents of Aspen Creek watched in stunned silence as the demolition crew, hired in their name, laughed while they tore down my home. They saw the excavator claw rip through the roof, saw the walls crumble. They heard the contractor say on camera, Brenda said she owned it. The room was frozen. I had them. The facts were clear, simple, and undeniable. Finally, I turned off the projector and looked directly at Brenda. She was pale, her composure completely gone. She looked trapped. Mrs. Winters, I said, my voice dropping a little. You have committed fraud. You have trespassed. You have destroyed private property. And in the process, I gestured towards the screen where Milo's drone footage had last played. You have endangered every home at the bottom of that hill. You did all this while hiding behind the authority you were given. I paused, letting the weight of it all sink in. It was time for the final receipt. There's one more thing you should know, I said. When I'm not up on that mountain, I have another residence. It's in the state capital. I let that hang in the air for a second. You're right, Mrs. Winters. This isn't a private matter anymore. It hasn't been since you forged a state document to destroy the private residence of a state official. I let the room gasp, let her face start to fall. My name is Redmond Kane, and perhaps you should have checked who you were sending your fake notices to, because I am the governor of this state. The silence in the room was absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked out. Jaws literally dropped. The man in the golf shirt looked like he was going to be sick. Brenda just stared, her face a mask of disbelief. This wasn't just some guy she could push around. She had picked a fight with the highest elected official in Colorado. The board member, Dana Morales, stood up, her hands shaking. She pointed a finger at Brenda. I knew it, she said, her voice trembling but clear. I told her we needed to see the original annexation papers. She said it was all taken care of. Then she looked at the rest of the board. I resign. Effective immediately. She grabbed her purse and walked out of the room, pushing past a news reporter who had slipped inside. Brenda, finally broken, turned and walked out through a side door, saying nothing. I looked at the remaining board members and the stunned residents. You forged state documents to destroy a state official's private residence, I said quietly. That's a felony. Several, actually. The crowd was buzzing, people talking over each other, a sense of panic and betrayal filling the room. They finally understood the truth. But I wasn't here to arrest her. Not yet. Her public humiliation was just the beginning. The real accounting was yet to come. The legal battle wasn't a dramatic, drawn-out affair with surprise witnesses and emotional outbursts. I didn't want a circus. I wanted a clinical, methodical execution of the facts. My legal team filed a civil suit against the Aspen Creek HOA as a corporate entity and against Brenda Winters as an individual. The case was built on the mountain of evidence I had already gathered. It was clean, straightforward, and overwhelming. When we walked into the county courtroom for the preliminary hearing, we didn't carry flashy briefcases. We brought 6 identical 3-inch binders, neatly tabbed and indexed. We had a corresponding set of USB drives. Each one was labeled with a simple letter, Exhibit A, Exhibit B, and so on. There would be no arguments over, he said, she said. We were there to present an unshakable documented timeline of events. The courtroom was quiet, almost sterile. The HOA had hired a lawyer who looked expensive but profoundly uncomfortable. Brenda sat beside him, looking smaller and older than she had in the clubhouse. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a dull, terrified resignation. She wouldn't meet my eyes. My attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Maria, handled the presentation. She didn't grandstand. She simply walked the judge through the Case 1 receipt at a time. Exhibit A was the binder containing all the property documents, my original deed, the county plat maps showing my lot's legal exclusion, the HA's own articles of incorporation, proving they were formed after my property was established. Maria calmly stated the foundational fact. Your Honor, the defendant, Aspen Creek HOA, never had any legal jurisdiction over my client's property. Everything that follows stems from this single undisputed fact. Exhibit D contained the falsified documents. We presented the photo of the forged county letter, the expert analysis of its metadata tracing it directly to Brenda's laptop, and a sworn affidavit from the Jefferson County Administrator confirming the document was fraudulent and that no such order was ever issued. The HA's lawyer made a weak attempt to object, claiming the metadata could have been tampered with, but the judge, an experienced, pragmatic woman in her 60s, waved him off. The evidence was too strong. Exhibit C was the complete unedited footage from all 6 of my security cameras with time codes overlaid. The judge watched on a monitor as the demolition crew arrived. As they referenced their orders and systematically leveled my home, we included the sworn statements from the demolition company's owner who confirmed he had acted in good faith based on the documents Brenda Winters provided him, documents he was told were legitimate. Exhibit D was Milo's full structural engineering report. It was thick with geological data, soil analysis, and computer-generated models showing the slope instability. Milo was there, and when called, he calmly explained to the judge that the unpermitted, reckless demolition had created a significant and ongoing landslide risk to the properties below, the very homes the HOA was supposed to protect. The judge looked over her glasses at the remaining HOA board members sitting in the gallery. The gravity of what Brenda had done on their behalf was beginning to settle on them like a physical weight. The final binders, Exhibits E and F, contained the financial accounting. We had appraisers' reports valuing the destroyed home at $3.2 million. We had itemized lists of all personal property, from furniture down to the silverware. We included the estimated value of my personal time spent on the case, my legal fees, and the cost of the experts I had hired. It was a cold, hard, factual accounting of what had been taken from me. When Maria was finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge looked at Brenda and her lawyer. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" she asked, her voice flat. The lawyer stood and shuffled some papers, but he had nothing. There was no defense against a mountain of facts. He mumbled something about his client believing she was acting in the community's best interest. The judge wasn't impressed. She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. Belief is not a legal defense for fraud, forgery, and the destruction of a $3 million private residence, she said. The verdict was swift and total. The judge found the Aspen Creek HOA liable on all counts: unauthorized demolition, forgery of legal documents, trespassing, and the creation of a public hazard through slope destabilization. The judgment was even more decisive. First, the HOA was ordered to pay restitution. The final number was $4.8 million. That covered the value of the home, the loss of all personal property, my legal fees, and punitive damages for their reckless and fraudulent conduct. Second, they were ordered to cover the full future cost of rebuilding the home, whatever it might be. Third, they were legally compelled to pay for the complete geological remediation of the mountainside, a project Milo estimated could cost an additional $500,000. Finally, the judge ordered the HOA to post a formal public apology on their website's homepage and on the Community Clubhouse Bulletin Board for a period of no less than 12 months. For Brenda Winters, the consequences were personal. The judge stripped her of her position as HOA president, effective immediately. But that was just the beginning. As the civil hearing concluded, a bailiff quietly entered the courtroom and approached her. The district attorney, having been provided with a copy of my evidence, had filed criminal charges, forgery of a public document, and felony destruction of property. We heard the quiet click of handcuffs in the background as they led her away. I didn't feel a sense of triumph, just a quiet, somber sense of order being restored. The system had worked because the facts were clear. Brenda wasn't a bad person in the way a movie villain is bad. She was a small one. She was a person who craved power and control so much she was willing to destroy things to get it. And what she learned that day was a lesson as old as the mountains themselves. Mountains don't care about small people with fake power. They just wait, and eventually everything built on a weak foundation collapses. 1 year later, I stood on the deck of my new home. The air smelled of freshly cut cedar and pine. The house was a near-perfect replica of the one Sarah had designed, but I'd made a few improvements. The foundation was deeper. The structural beams were reinforced steel wrapped in Douglas fir, and the windows were triple-pane glass that made the whole great room feel like part of the mountain. The HOA's insurance company, facing a catastrophe, had paid out the judgment without a fight. The rebuild was not about erasing what happened. It was about honoring the memory of what was lost by building it back stronger. I walked inside and ran my hand over the great stone fireplace. It was the centerpiece of the room, just as before. The river stones were almost the same color, sourced from the same quarry, and set into the hearthstone was a small, simple bronze plaque. It just read, "Sarah's house, built with love, rebuilt with purpose." Beneath it, her ashes were once again resting in a place of peace, this time encased in a small permanent vault within the foundation itself. The fallout in the Aspen Creek subdivision had been seismic. The multi-million-dollar judgment and the cost of the slope remediation had forced the HOA to levy a massive special assessment on every single homeowner. Their dues tripled overnight. The residents, who had once been complacent or intimidated by Brenda's rule, were suddenly paying the price for her arrogance. Faced with the stark financial reality of their situation, they finally woke up. The first to act was Dana Morales, the board member who had resigned. Using her old paralegal skills, she started digging into the HA's history, its bylaws, and its finances. She found a pattern of overreach, of improperly recorded minutes, of funds being used for Brenda's pet projects. She organized her neighbors, not with threats, but with facts. She went door to door with copies of the court filings and Milo's engineering report, explaining exactly how Brenda's actions had put them all at risk, both physically and financially. Turns out, when you show people the receipts, they stop believing the clipboard. 3 months after the court case, Dana and a committee of residents had gathered enough signatures to force a vote to dissolve the Aspen Creek HOA entirely. The measure passed with an overwhelming 89% majority. They dismantled the whole structure of petty tyranny. The covenants were dissolved. The Architectural Review Committee was disbanded. People could now plant whatever flowers they wanted. The clubhouse, once the seat of Brenda's little empire, was repurposed. Her old office, with its view of the parking lot, was turned into a community tool library run by volunteers. The residents started talking to each other again, not as potential violators of some arbitrary rule, but as neighbors. They organized a neighborhood watch, not to report on each other, but to look out for each other. I never sought revenge against Brenda Winters. Revenge is an emotional, messy pursuit. I sought accountability, and the system, when presented with undeniable facts, delivered it. The criminal charges stuck. She was found guilty of forgery and served 6 months in a county facility, followed by a long probation. She had to sell her perfectly manicured house to pay her legal bills and her share of the restitution. She lost everything: her power, her reputation, her home. Her punishment wasn't something I inflicted. It was the natural consequence of her own choices. I found my own peace, not in her downfall, but in the rebuilding. On weekends, my 2 grandkids would come up to the new house. We'd fly a kite on the lawn where the excavator tracks used to be. We'd sit by the fire, and I'd tell them stories about their grandmother. I didn't tell them the whole story of what happened to the first house. I just told them that sometimes things get broken, and it's our job to build them back better than they were before. My goal was never to destroy a community. It was to protect my own peace and privacy. But in the end, by standing up to a bully with a clipboard, The entire community found a better version of itself. They stopped being afraid of their neighbors and started trusting them instead. They traded rules for relationships. I learned something, too. A home is more than wood and stone. It's a repository of memory, a sanctuary of peace. And when someone tries to take that away, you don't fight them with anger. They tore down my house. So I built something stronger, truth on paper and trust in my neighbors. As I stood on the deck, a quiet wind whispered through the pine trees. My American flag, on its fully permitted flagpole, waved gently in the breeze. Down below, my grandkids were chasing a soccer ball across the grass. The house was quiet. The mountain was quiet. Everything was exactly as it should be.